I was interning then, so I was probably about 25 or 26. And I attended a concert of the 14th String Quartet of Beethoven. The Juilliard Quartet was giving a series of Beethoven quartets, and that particular evening they were doing the 14th. When we speak of Beethoven's last quartets, we speak of numbers 12 through 16. But the core of those last quartets are the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which actually were not written in that order. They were really written. The 15th was first, then the 13th, and then the 14th. But they were published in the order of 13th, 14th, and 15th. But those three quartets form a unit, and they really represent the end of the journey. And they were unlike any music anybody, I think, has ever composed. The 14th quartet, C-sharp minor, is the acme of all that. It's preceded by the 15th and the 13th, and it begins with a slow movement, which is a fugue, which probably, I would say, comes as close as any artist has ever come in rendering what the peace of heaven is like. There's a peace in that music that is beyond anything in this world. When St. Paul talked about the peace that passes understanding, that's the peace that Beethoven captured in that opening movement. The quartet itself is exceptional and unusual in its form. It's 7 movements, but they're not discrete movements. They just kind of flow, like ebb and flow, different tempi, different moods, but it's like all of one piece. But that opening fugue, that adagio, is unlike anything else. And this evening, while I was listening to it, I felt for the first time I was beginning to really hear what was there. And I remember it was a very dramatic experience for me. I felt that there were no barriers. There's a passage, there's a section, of course, beyond the body, which we may look at later on, where Jesus talks about that everyone knows and has at some point had the experience when they join with something beyond themselves and become one with it. Right. I remember when I read that section for the first time, what I thought of immediately was that experience of Beethoven. Anyway, the following morning, I had a therapy patient early at the hospital that I was interning at, and I remember driving to work. It was about a 30-minute drive, and I remember very specifically saying to myself, I want to have that experience that I had the previous night carry over, and I did not know how to do that. I wanted to have whatever it is I was doing with this patient, who was a woman, I think. I wanted the mood in the room to somehow be an extension of what I had felt the previous night. And that was the first time I'd ever felt that as a goal. And it was important for me because it was one of the early steps that I was taking to bring together these two tracks that my life had been divided into. The external, which was becoming a psychologist, specifically a psychotherapist, and the internal, which was music and what I guess I used to refer to as the Beethoven Experience. And this was the first time I felt there was at least a possibility. I understood the importance of bringing these two together. I think I came away from the session feeling like an abysmal failure because I knew I did not do that. Whatever it was that went on in the session, I knew was miles away from what I had experienced the previous evening. But I at least now knew what the ideal was. And that became very, very important to me. The second experience had to do with Franz Schubert. I might mention, by the way, that these 3 experiences that I'm talking about, I never related together until thinking about this workshop. When I began to think back to those experiences, and I suddenly realized that they really all formed like one piece. The Schubert experience was a little different, in that the focus was no longer on me, but I felt the focus was more on Schubert. Just to give you a little background on Schubert, he died 1 year after Beethoven. Beethoven died in 1827, Schubert died in 1828, but he lived almost half the life. He died at 31. Beethoven died at 57. His was a particularly tragic life. He was not very, very happy. He was depressed, but he was a great, great composer, and he worshipped Beethoven. The last year of his life, he wrote some of his greatest work, including two trios. Trio being that it was written for violin, piano, and cello. And this is the trio in B flat and E flat. Number 1, number 2. He only wrote 2 of them. This particular evening, I was going to listen to the second of these two trios in E flat. Up until that point, my experience of Schubert had been, as it still is, that when you listen to him, especially his mature music, there's a profound sadness that you feel in his music. It's very deep. It's not that it's just sad music. It's not that it's in a minor key and it feels sad. It's that there's a profound sadness that kind of permeates his work, which I think mirrored the sadness in his life. And when I heard this performance that evening, I suddenly understood where the sadness was coming from. It was always there. It was just something that was kind of a given. But when I listened to this trio, which is among his greatest works, I'm not sure when it happened. I suspect it was probably in the second movement. I suddenly could hear a part of Schubert saying, "I'm not going to go there." It was like the place where Beethoven went. Schubert was saying, "I'm just not going to go there. I can't go there. I won't go there. I'm not able to," or whatever it was. But you could almost hear it in the music, and I heard it. And I came away from that really understanding that if you listen very carefully, you will hear the soul, whether it's a composer, whether it be a poet, whether it would be a psychotherapy patient, whether it be anybody. That if you really listen, you could hear. I'm not sure what I did with that. Again, a lot of what I'm saying now is more kind of retrospectively looking at this. And I certainly did not connect it up with the Beethoven experience as I'm going to do now. But it was very clear that in listening to Schubert, you could hear the block. You could hear the place where he was saying, "I won't go there." It didn't stop the trio from being a magnificent creative work, a magnificent experience to listen to. But again, I think part of the reason that he worshipped Beethoven so was that he recognized Beethoven went to a place he could not go. It's interesting, by the way, that they are buried side by side. I was reading at that time when I was still in graduate school. I was reading some of the work of R.D. Laing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. L-A-I-N-G. In the '60s, especially, he was like the prophet of schizophrenia. His books were very, very popular, especially among us graduate students, because we were all fed up with the psychiatric establishment, how patients were treated. They were over-medicated. They were kind of locked away. They were given electric shock treatment without anybody knowing why they were given electric shock treatment. And Laing spoke for the experience of psychosis. And he wrote very, very poetically. He did not write so much as a scientist as much as somebody who really felt it. And I discovered afterwards he himself had a number of psychotic breaks, so he was really speaking from his own experience. And the point of his work was that a schizophrenic, the part of the psychotic break was a journey. And they had to leave the world and go into their inner space. And the task of the therapist was to help that patient get to the other side. And in his book, this one particular book called The Politics of Experience, he described working with one man who had a psychotic break and how he was working with him in a hospital. And in a sense, it was part of an inner journey. And in the book, he described how the man described how, as he was going through this and could begin to see the light after going through this tunnel of darkness and tremendous terror, that he was still aware there was a place he was not going to go. And when he got through and he basically recovered and resumed living a relatively normal life, there was yet a place that he articulated. He said, "I'm not going there." And when I read that, I recognized that's the same place that I had felt in Schubert, and I could begin to feel in other people. I was able to feel it in myself when I would hear Beethoven's music and aware that there was still more to do. There was still a place, there was still a part of the journey to go.